A retired Navy SEAL found a frightened German Shepherd puppy beneath a laundromat awning and carried her home. But the next morning, her mother appeared outside the veterinary clinic and refused to follow them. She ignored food, stared toward the eastern road, and vanished into the rain. Michael thought she was abandoning her puppy. He was wrong. Somewhere beyond the silent warehouses, another tiny life was still waiting for her return, and the truth would force him to risk losing the puppy who had already begun healing his broken heart. Before we begin, tell us the city you're watching from in the comments, and please subscribe to support more powerful stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances. Cold rain drifted across Roanoke that March afternoon, silvering the empty sidewalks and hiding the Blue Ridge Mountains behind low gray clouds. Michael Hayes was driving home when he noticed movement beneath the awning of a closed laundromat. At 42, the former Navy SEAL still had the disciplined build of a man trained for danger. Tall, broad-shouldered, with weathered fair skin, a square jaw, short dark brown hair graying at the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard. His blue-gray eyes rarely revealed what he felt. A failed rescue years earlier had made him courteous but distant, trusted yet truly known by almost no one. A German Shepherd puppy stood beside a metal bench. She was about 7 weeks old, small enough to fit beneath one arm, with black and tan fur, a pale cream muzzle, a white mark beneath her chin, and one soft ear beginning to rise while the other folded sideways. She looked thin, but uninjured. Each time a truck passed, she pressed against the brick wall, then raised her head and cried towards the empty road. Michael parked at the far end of the lot, closed the door gently, and stopped several yards away. The puppy watched him, trembling more from uncertainty than cold. He lowered himself onto one knee and kept his hands visible. "Easy," he said. "I'm not coming closer." His deep voice had once calmed frightened soldiers and military dogs. The puppy stepped backward. Michael resisted the urge to reach for her. In another life, hesitation had cost seconds, and seconds had cost lives. Waiting still felt dangerously close to failure. But this was not a battlefield. The little dog needed a choice, not an order. He removed his canvas coat and spread it across the wet pavement. Rain tapped against the awning. The puppy sniffed the air, approached the coat, and placed one paw on the sleeve. She studied Michael's face, climbed onto the fabric, and pushed her nose into the cuff. Michael extended 2 fingers. Her cold nose touched them. Something inside his chest tightened. "There you are," he whispered. When he lifted her, she stiffened for one heartbeat, then tucked herself against his red and black flannel shirt and hooked a paw over his collar. Michael searched behind the laundromat, around the dumpsters, beneath the stairs, and along the muddy railroad fence. He called softly and waited. Nothing answered except freight cars groaning in the distance. Across the street, Ryan Miller worked alone inside a convenience store. He was a slim man in his early 30s with sandy hair, tired hazel eyes, and easy politeness. He studied the puppy peering from Michael's coat. "Never saw that little one," he said, but a full-grown shepherd crossed here around sunrise. Dark back, no collar, she ran toward the old commercial blocks. Michael left his number and carried the puppy home. He placed her beside a bowl of water. She drank too quickly, sneezed into it, and shoved the bowl beneath a chair. While Michael wiped the spill, she grabbed the towel and pulled until she tumbled backward. Later, she stepped into a dish of softened food and crossed the kitchen, leaving pale paw prints behind her. Michael stared at the trail, the towel around her legs, and the solemn expression on her food-speckled face. A laugh escaped him, rough, rusty, almost unfamiliar. The puppy wagged once as though she had been waiting for that sound. For years, his house had held only the furnace and wall clock. Now, tiny claws followed him everywhere. That night, Michael placed a new bed beside his bedroom door, but the puppy ignored it and curled upon his flannel shirt. He named her Molly because the ordinary name felt warmer than the silence around them. Before turning off the lamp, he opened the drawer and found the metal dog tag of Luke Dawson, his former teammate. Luke had been a broad-faced, dark-haired man whose reckless humor once held their unit together. Michael remembered arriving minutes too late to save him. He closed his fist around the tag and looked at Molly sleeping nearby. How long had she waited beneath that awning before someone finally stopped? Rain whispered against the window. Michael rose to check the lock, then froze. Beneath the street lamp across from his house stood the silhouette of an adult German shepherd. She stared toward the window for several silent seconds before turning into the rain and disappearing. Morning came pale and wet over Roanoke, with rainwater ticking from gutters and low clouds resting against the Blue Ridge foothills. Michael had slept in fragments. Each time he opened his eyes, Molly was still curled on the flannel shirt beside his bedroom door, one paw stretched toward the hall. Before sunrise, she followed him into the kitchen, sat on his slipper while he made coffee, and rose whenever he moved more than a few steps away. He tried not to wonder whether she feared he might vanish. By 8, he had settled her inside a laundry basket lined with the same shirt and driven toward Blue Ridge Veterinary Clinic. Molly spent most of the trip chewing one sleeve through the basket slats, pausing whenever a truck passed close enough to shake the windows. Dr. Sarah Mitchell met them in an examination room that smelled of disinfectant and clean cotton. Sarah was 38, tall and lean, with warm brown skin, dark hazel eyes, and thick black hair pulled into a practical braid. Her narrow face softened around animals, though years of emergency work had taught her to speak plainly when kindness alone could solve nothing. She wore navy scrubs beneath a gray clinic jacket and moved with the calm precision of someone who understood that frightened creatures often watched hands before faces. So this is the laundromat criminal, Sarah said as Molly reached for the cord on Michael's sweatshirt. She has already confessed to 3 towels and a bowl of food, Michael replied. Sarah placed Molly on the padded table. The puppy sniffed the stethoscope, caught the rubber tubing between her teeth, and pulled. Sarah freed it gently, then checked her eyes, ears, paws, teeth, heartbeat, and abdomen. Molly tolerated the examination until Sarah looked inside her mouth when she tried to sit on the doctor's wrist. 6 or 7 weeks, Sarah said. Slightly underweight but healthy. She can eat softened puppy food now. A scanner passed slowly over Molly's shoulders and back without making a sound. No microchip, no hidden number that might lead Michael to an owner, a home, or an explanation. Molly leaned against his forearm as if the touch had happened by accident. Michael had worked beside military dogs trained to obey through gunfire, but this small animal had no training, no handler, and no reason to trust him. Still, she had chosen his coat beneath the laundromat awning. That choice settled uneasily inside him. It felt less like gratitude than responsibility. By the time Sarah finished explaining feeding intervals and the dangers of electrical cords, loose medication, and anything small enough to swallow, Molly had tugged Sarah's jacket zipper and fallen asleep across Michael's boots. "She does that whenever I stop moving," Michael said. Sarah crouched beside the puppy. Movement may be what she associates with being left behind. The words brought Luke Dawson's metal tag back into Michael's mind. For years, he had believed discipline meant moving quickly enough to prevent regret. On the mission that killed Luke, Michael's team had been delayed by bad intelligence and a blocked mountain road. They had arrived minutes too late, and those minutes had followed him into every silent room afterward. Yet, Molly seemed to need the opposite of speed. She needed someone who would remain when nothing dramatic was happening. Sometimes safety began when someone stayed. Michael carried her outside beneath his canvas coat. The rain had weakened to a fine mist, and the parking lot shone beneath a colorless sky. He had taken only a few steps when Molly lifted her head. Across the street, beneath a bare maple tree, stood an adult German shepherd. She was about 3 years old, lean but strong, with a deep black saddle across her back, dark tan legs, a narrow, intelligent face, and amber-brown eyes that measured every distance between herself and the people around her. A small notch marked the tip of her left ear. Damp fur clung to her ribs, revealing a body hardened by hunger, cold nights, and constant movement. Nothing in her posture suggested aggression. She did not bare her teeth or lower herself to attack. She simply watched Molly with the rigid concentration of a mother who had learned that one careless step could cost her everything. Michael stopped. The shepherd lifted her nose, testing the air between them. Molly stared through the opening of his coat but did not bark, whine, or struggle to get down. Instead, she pushed her face into Michael's chest and gripped his flannel shirt with one front paw. The reaction confused him. If the shepherd was Molly's mother, why did the puppy not run to her? If she was not, why had she appeared outside the clinic and fixed her attention on the bundle in his arms? Sarah came through the clinic door and stopped beside Michael. Her eyes moved from the dog's thin body to the road running east past the old commercial buildings. "Don't face her directly," she murmured. "Give her room." Sarah placed a bowl of food near the curb and backed away. The shepherd's nose moved, but she did not approach it. Michael carried Molly to the truck, opened the rear door, spread a blanket across the seat, and stepped several yards away, leaving a clear path. "Come on," he said softly. "No one's going to force you." The shepherd stepped from beneath the maple tree. One paw touched the wet asphalt. Then another. She stopped at the edge of the truck's shadow and looked first at Molly, then sharply toward the eastern blocks. For one suspended second, Michael believed she would climb inside. Instead, she backed away. He lowered Molly slightly so the two dogs could see each other clearly. The adult shepherd came close enough for Michael to see rain gathered along her whiskers. Her amber eyes rested on Molly with something deeper than curiosity. Recognition, perhaps. Concern. Yet, when an engine growled somewhere beyond the buildings, her head turned immediately toward the sound. Her shoulders remained angled toward the truck. Her hind feet were prepared to carry her in the opposite direction. Michael recognized the conflict in her body. She was not simply afraid of him. Fear would have pulled her away from the entire scene. This dog was being pulled toward two places at once. The shepherd ignored the food, walked to the end of the block, and paused beside a closed pharmacy. She looked back directly at Michael. The gesture was so deliberate that he felt the old instincts in him awaken. She was not merely leaving. She seemed to be checking whether he understood. Then she disappeared around the corner. Michael secured Molly inside the basket and drove after her. He checked the pharmacy alley, the loading docks, and two narrow streets behind the clinic. Once, he saw a dark tail slip between two parked vans, but by the time he turned the truck, the shepherd had vanished. He wanted to keep driving east. The old part of him demanded a wider search, a faster pursuit, an answer before the trail went cold. Sarah's warning stopped him. A protective dog under pressure might abandon a familiar route entirely, and Molly was too young to spend hours being carried through cold rain. Back at the clinic, Sarah lifted the untouched food bowl. "She came here for Molly," Michael said, "but she chose to leave." Sarah studied the empty street. Maybe she chose to return. That distinction followed him home. Molly spent the afternoon dragging a sock through the hallway, failing to climb onto the sofa and attacking the rug fringe as though it had caused her fall. When Michael removed the glove he had worn outside the clinic, she abandoned the sock immediately. She approached the leather slowly, sniffed from the wrist to the fingertips, and pressed both front paws over the palm before lying across it. Michael crouched beside her. The glove carried the smells of rain, pavement, and perhaps the shepherd who had stood near the truck. Molly closed her eyes without releasing it. The older dog had vanished, yet some part of her had followed them home. That evening, Michael called Sarah. He described the untouched food, the repeated glances east, and the way the shepherd's body had leaned toward the truck while her feet remained ready to run away. Sarah was silent for several seconds. "Fear usually pulls a dog away from everything," she said. That dog was choosing between two directions. Michael looked toward Molly, asleep across the glove beneath the kitchen chair. "Then what was in the other direction?" he asked. "If Molly isn't her only puppy," Sarah said, "then another one may still be waiting for its mother tonight." By dawn, the rain had thinned into mist, leaving Roanoke's old commercial district washed in gray light, and the streets shining like dark ribbons beneath the clouds. Michael printed 2 photographs at a pharmacy kiosk before most businesses opened. One showed Molly sitting in his kitchen with her folded ear and pale mark beneath her chin clearly visible. The other had been taken outside the veterinary clinic, catching the adult German shepherd beneath the maple tree with her lean body turned toward the eastern road. Michael placed both photographs inside clear plastic sleeves, tucked them into his canvas coat, and returned home long enough to feed Molly. She followed him from the counter to the sink, then planted herself across the toes of his boots when she sensed he was preparing to leave. The sight tightened something in him. He did not like leaving her, even for an hour, but carrying a young puppy through wet streets and crowded shops would exhaust her. He secured the kitchen gate, placed his flannel shirt inside her bed, and promised himself the search would be brief. Molly watched from behind the mesh, one ear folded, her dark eyes following him until the front door closed. The first answers came in fragments. A florist named Evelyn Price, a small woman in her 50s with silver blonde hair and quick green eyes, remembered seeing the shepherd beside her loading entrance before sunrise. Evelyn spoke rapidly and arranged every sentence as neatly as the flowers in her window, but she could offer only a direction: east. The delivery driver named Marcus Bell had seen the same dog cross behind an old motel. Marcus was a broad, heavy-set man with a shaved head, a gray beard, and the tired patience of someone who spent his life waiting for doors to open. He said the shepherd never begged and never approached his truck, though once she had watched him unload bread until he drove away. At a hardware store, 70-year-old Harold Green studied the photograph through thick glasses. He was narrow-shouldered, bald except for a white fringe above his ears, and cautious by habit after 40 years of keeping accounts down to the last cent. He had seen the dog near the warehouse roofs, always moving before the streets became busy. None of them knew where she slept. Each memory ended where the next alley began. Michael returned home before noon. Molly had managed to pull his flannel shirt halfway through the kitchen gate and was asleep with one sleeve beneath her chin. She woke the moment his key touched the lock, rose on her hind legs, and scratched lightly at the mesh. Her relief was so immediate that guilt struck him harder than he expected. He had been gone less than 2 hours, yet Molly greeted him as though he had returned from a war. He sat on the kitchen floor and let her climb into his lap. "I came back," he told her. The words were meant for the puppy, but for an instant he heard Luke Dawson's voice in the back of his mind, laughing before that final mission and telling Michael not to make promises to men who already knew the risks. Michael lowered his face against Molly's soft head. He could not change the promise he had failed to keep years ago. He could only decide what kind of the man would answer the next living thing that waited for him. The most important lead came that afternoon on Alder Street. Collins Family Grocery occupied a narrow brick building between a vacant clothing shop and a repair garage. Hand-painted prices filled the front windows, and an old brass bell rang when Michael entered. Margaret Collins stood behind the counter opening a box of canned soup. She was 68, short and sturdy, with fair skin, a square face softened by age, and silver hair cut neatly to her jaw. Reading glasses hung from a red cord around her neck. Her pale blue eyes were sharp, and her blunt manner had been shaped by 4 decades of managing suppliers, impatient customers, and a husband who had died before learning how to slow down. Margaret rarely wasted words, but her kindness appeared in practical forms. An extra loaf slipped into a struggling family's bag, a chair placed near the register for an exhausted delivery man, and a metal water bowl hidden behind the store. Michael laid the photographs on the counter. Margaret looked at the adult shepherd and immediately stopped unpacking. "I know her," she said. "Do you know where she goes?" "No, but I know when she comes." Margaret led him through a storage room to the alley behind the grocery. Near the wall sat a dented metal bowl and a plastic container protected beneath an overturned crate. She explained that the shepherd appeared before sunrise when the street was still quiet. At first, Margaret had left scraps. Then she began leaving proper dog food and clean water. The dog never approached while Margaret stood nearby. She waited across the parking lot until the back door closed, then came to eat. "I started calling her Sadie," Margaret said. "A creature deserves a name, even when she won't let you close enough to tell her." Michael looked at the photograph. The name seemed to fit the amber eyes and patient vigilance. Margaret had called the county shelter weeks earlier, But Sadie always disappeared before anyone arrived. What interested Michael most was the way she ate. "She never finishes here," Margaret said. "Sometimes she carries food away. Not for herself. A hungry dog eats where the food is. A mother takes it somewhere else." The statement gave shape to Sarah's suspicion. Michael felt urgency rise in him, but he kept his voice controlled. "Have you ever seen the puppies?" Margaret shook her head. "Only tracks after rain, small ones." She agreed to telephone if Sadie returned. Michael left his number beneath the register and came back early the next morning. Frost silvered the tops of the fences, and the mist had thickened until the far buildings appeared unfinished. Sadie did not come. Michael was replacing a damp corner of Molly's photograph in the grocery window when the bell rang behind him. Linda Carter entered wearing a reflective city jacket over work clothes darkened by moisture. She was 46, medium height and broad through the shoulders, with deep brown skin, strong cheekbones, and black hair braided close to her scalp. A pale line crossed one eyebrow from a street cleaning accident years earlier, when a distracted driver had struck the side of her vehicle. Since then, Linda noticed roads, engines, and moving shapes with almost uncomfortable precision. She carried a paper cup in one hand and damp gloves in the other. Her gaze landed on Molly's picture, and her expression changed. "I've seen that puppy." Michael turned fully toward her. Linda explained that she operated an early street sweeper through the commercial blocks. A week earlier, near a plant nursery that closed during winter, she had seen Sadie cross a rear parking lot with 2 German Shepherd puppies moving around her legs. One had a folded ear and a light mark beneath the chin. Linda touched the same spot in Molly's photograph. "The next morning after this one disappeared," she continued, "the mother came through again. Only one puppy was with her." Michael felt the room narrow around that sentence. Molly had not simply wandered from an empty place. She had been separated from a family that continued moving without her because survival allowed no time to stop. Linda turned an old invoice over and drew the route. Sadie crossed Alder Street near a closed tire shop, passed behind 3 storage buildings, and disappeared through the northern fence of Green Valley Nursery. Linda had never followed closely. The sweeper's engine frightened the dogs, and Sadie always changed direction when it approached. Michael called the number painted on the nursery sign. The owner, Daniel Brooks, answered after several rings. Daniel was a 55-year-old widower with a low, gravelly voice and the careful temperament of a man who had rebuilt his business after a fire 10 years earlier. He confirmed the nursery was closed, but warned that delivery trucks and seasonal workers would arrive in 3 days to prepare for spring reopening. He gave Michael permission to inspect the outer property as long as the gates remained secured. Before Michael could leave, a weather alert appeared on Linda's phone. Cold rain was expected to move over the Blue Ridge by the following night, with temperatures dropping close to freezing. Michael stared at the hand-drawn route. If Sadie felt threatened by trucks, workers, or worsening weather, she might move the remaining puppy. Once she abandoned the route Margaret and Linda knew, finding her again could become impossible. Margaret disappeared into the back room and returned with a paper bag containing softened puppy food and 2 stainless steel bowls. Both still carried store labels. "Old stock," she said. "They're new. They became old when I decided not to sell them." Michael did not argue. He thanked Linda, took the map, and drove home for Molly. The puppy bounced against the kitchen gate when she saw him, then tried to climb into his coat before he had fully crouched. He fitted her with a light harness and carried her to the truck. During the drive east, Molly stood inside the basket, sniffing through the slats as though the air itself had begun telling her a story. Michael parked 1 block from Green Valley Nursery and continued on foot. The nursery lay behind rows of warehouses, its glass roofs dim beneath the fog. Molly investigated every wet leaf and crack in the pavement until they neared the northern fence. Then she stopped. Her nose lifted. Her body became very still. Movement formed at the far end of the alley. Sadie stepped from the mist. Her damp black and tan coat blended with the shadows, but her amber eyes stayed fixed on Molly. She did not come closer. Instead, she turned toward a narrow break beneath the rusted fence slipped through it, and paused on the other side. For one long moment, she looked directly at Michael. Then she waited. Sadie remained motionless beyond the rusted fence, half hidden by the pale fog drifting between the abandoned greenhouses. Her amber eyes moved from Molly to Michael, then toward the narrow path behind her. She did not bark or lower her head. She simply waited, her damp body held with the tense patience of an animal that had already decided how close a human was allowed to come. Michael studied the opening beneath the fence before moving. Broken wire curled near one post, and shards from an old planting tray lay in the weeds. He walked to the edge of the alley until he found a safer gap, then checked the ground beyond it for nails, glass, and anything that might cut Molly's paws. Only after he was certain did he loosen the puppy's leash. Molly stood pressed against his boot, her black and tan body unusually still. The playful creature who had attacked towels and chased food bowls was gone. Her nose worked rapidly as she tested the air. Sadie turned away, slipped deeper into the nursery, and looked back once. Michael unclipped the leash. "Go on," he whispered. Molly glanced up at him as though asking whether leaving his side would make him disappear. The question struck him harder than it should have. He lowered one hand and allowed her to smell his fingers. "I'll be here." Molly took 2 uncertain steps, stopped, then ran after Sadie. Michael followed at a distance, placing his boots carefully on strips of bare concrete between the weeds. The nursery had been closed through winter, leaving rows of empty wooden tables, overturned pots, and plastic sheeting that stirred whenever the wind passed beneath it. Fog collected inside the long glass houses, blurring their metal frames into pale ribs. Sadie never moved far enough to vanish. She walked ahead, paused to confirm that Molly still followed, then continued toward the rear of the property. Michael understood the message in her pace. She was leading Molly somewhere, but she had not yet decided whether the man behind her belonged there. He kept his shoulders angled away and resisted the instinct to shorten the distance. Years in the SEAL teams had taught him to take control of uncertain ground, to close gaps before danger could use them. Sadie required the opposite. Every step he refused to rush became part of the fragile bargain between them. They passed a collapsed shade canopy and reached an old potting shed attached to the side of a greenhouse. A broad sheet metal awning covered the concrete beneath it. Empty nursery pots had been arranged along the open sides, forming a rough wall against the wind. Several rubber mats lay pushed together near the back, dry except where rain had blown beneath the edge. Sadie stopped in front of them. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a small black nose appeared between 2 overturned pots. A German Shepherd puppy slowly raised his head. He was about the same age as Molly, perhaps 7 weeks, but slightly smaller and thinner. His coat was tan with a dark saddle beginning to spread along his back, and the fur around his narrow chest was damp and flattened. Both ears remained soft, folding outward from a head that seemed too large for his fragile body. His eyes were deep brown and watchful, carrying the cautious seriousness of a puppy who had learned too early that the world could change whenever his mother walked away. Later, he would be called Toby, but in that moment he was only the little life Sadie had refused to abandon. The puppy pressed himself against Sadie's front leg. She lowered her head and touched his back with her nose, then positioned her body between him and Michael. Molly stopped several feet away. Her tail remained low and her ears shifted as she listened. For one painful second, Michael wondered whether they had been separated long enough for recognition to fail. Molly lowered her nose and moved forward in a shallow curve rather than walking directly at him. The smaller puppy leaned farther into Sadie, but he did not retreat behind the pots. Molly gave a faint, trembling sound. It was not a bark or cry, only a breath carrying something older than memory. She stretched her neck until their noses met. Toby froze. He sniffed the cream-colored patch beneath Molly's chin, then moved quickly along her cheek and folded ear. His entire body changed. The tension left his legs, and he pushed himself beneath Molly's neck with such sudden force that both puppies stumbled sideways. Molly pawed at his shoulder. Toby caught the edge of her ear between his tiny teeth, and within seconds they rolled together across the rubber mats. A length of frayed rope lay near the wall. Molly grabbed one end, Toby seized the other, and their careful reunion became an awkward contest of paws, growls, and wagging tails. One empty pot tipped over with a hollow clatter. Toby startled and dropped flat, but Molly bumped her shoulder against his and attacked the rope again. Slowly, he rose and followed. Michael felt relief move through him, but it did not arrive alone. The sight of the puppies playing made the truth unmistakable. Sadie had left this smaller dog alone each morning while she searched for food. She had crossed streets, avoided vehicles, and waited behind Margaret's grocery because returning empty-mouthed was not an option. At the veterinary clinic, she had found Molly alive, warm, and held safely against Michael's chest. Yet Toby had still been here, hidden beneath a metal roof, waiting for the sound of his mother's paws. Sadie had not rejected Molly. She had recognized that one child had protection while the other had no one. Michael set Margaret's 2 bowls near the edge of the shelter. He poured softened puppy food into one and water into the other, then backed away. Toby stopped playing and looked toward the food. Sadie stepped in front of him at once. Her head remained level, but the muscles along her back tightened. Michael lowered himself beside a greenhouse wall, keeping both hands visible. "I'm not taking him from you," he said softly. Sadie watched him without blinking. Toby tried to look around her legs, but she shifted with him, maintaining the barrier. Molly approached the food, took 2 quick bites, then looked back at Michael. He gave the low whistle he had begun using at home. Her folded ear moved toward the sound. She glanced at Sadie and Toby. For several seconds she stood between 2 kinds of safety: the family whose scent lived beneath her earliest memories, and the man whose coat had become the first shelter she trusted. Michael felt ashamed for calling her away, yet leaving her there would complicate every attempt to earn Sadie's trust. Molly needed food, warmth, and veterinary care. More importantly, Sadie needed to see that Michael could take Molly away without threatening Toby. He whistled again. Molly ran to him. She climbed against his knee and he lifted her beneath the chest. Her body remained turned toward the shelter. Toby stood at the edge of the mats, staring after her. Sadie did not advance or retreat. Michael carried Molly toward the fence slowly, looking back only once. The mother dog had moved beside Toby, her shoulder touching his small body. Inside the truck, Molly paced across the blanket and cried toward the nursery. Michael sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Finding the missing puppy should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing outside a locked room after locating the person trapped inside. He knew where Sadie and Toby were, but knowing did not give him the right to force them into his truck. If he returned with cages, ropes, or too many strangers, Sadie might flee before anyone could secure her. If he waited too long, the weather or the returning workers might drive her away. Rain began striking the windshield in scattered drops. Michael looked through the side window toward the fence. Beneath the vibrating metal awning, Sadie had curled her lean body around Toby. Only the puppy's small face remained visible against her chest. Michael's phone sounded from the passenger's seat. A weather warning filled the screen. Temperatures would fall close to freezing before dawn. Below it, the calendar reminded him that only 2 days remained before delivery trucks and workers returned to Green Valley Nursery. The temperature fell through the evening, and by sunrise a thin skin of ice had formed along the gutters of Green Valley Nursery. Michael returned before the city fully woke, carrying fresh water, softened puppy food, 2 folded towels, and a thick rubber mat from his garage. He left Molly at home for the first visit. Sadie needed to learn that his presence did not always mean he would take something from her, and Toby needed a chance to watch him without the excitement of his sister nearby. Michael entered through the northern fence slowly and stopped well outside the shelter. Sadie rose at once. Her lean, black and tan body moved in front of Toby, her amber eyes following Michael's boots, hands, and shoulders. He placed the water and food near the edge of the awning, then carried the rubber mat only halfway toward the wall. When Sadie's muscles tightened, he stopped. He lowered the mat, unfolded the towels beside it, and backed away without looking directly at her. Instead of leaving, he sat on an overturned wooden crate with his back partly turned. The position felt unnatural. During his years as a Navy SEAL, turning away from uncertainty had been an invitation to danger. Every nerve in him wanted to watch Sadie closely, to predict the instant she might run or defend her puppy. Yet trust could not grow beneath constant scrutiny. He rested his forearms on his knees and listened to the soft scrape of Toby's paws against concrete. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the puppy's small face appeared beside Sadie's front leg. Toby stared at Michael, both soft ears folded outward, his narrow chest rising quickly. Michael did not move. The puppy took one step toward the water, then retreated when a sheet of plastic snapped in the wind. Sadie waited even longer. Only after Michael stood and walked beyond the fence did she approach the bowls. From beside his truck, he watched through the side mirror as she ate rapidly, drank, then carried part of the softened food back to Toby. It was not victory, but it was the first morning she had accepted something while knowing exactly where Michael waited. On the second day, the clouds lifted enough for weak sunlight to pass through the greenhouse glass. Michael brought Molly in her basket and set a small transport crate near the shelter. He tied the door open so it could not swing shut, spread one towel across the floor, and placed the other beside it. Molly climbed out before he had fully stepped back. She ran to Toby, touched noses with him, and immediately stole the frayed rope from beneath his paws. Toby followed her through the empty pots, his cautious movements growing faster as her confidence pulled him forward. Michael placed several pieces of food near the crate entrance. Molly found them first. She stepped inside, turned twice, grabbed the towel, and backed out with it clenched between her teeth. Toby seized the loose end. The two puppies rolled against the crate wall, growling with the fierce seriousness of animals too young to understand that neither had won anything. Sadie stood several feet away, watching the metal frame. She sniffed the air but refused to approach it. Michael sat near the greenhouse wall, close enough for the puppies to investigate but far enough that Sadie still had a clear path to the fence. Molly came to his boots and curled between them. Toby remained near his sister for several minutes before stretching his neck toward Michael's left boot. He sniffed the worn leather, pulled back, then stepped forward again. Michael kept his hands still. Toby touched his nose to the boot and hurried back to Sadie as if embarrassed by his own courage. Sadie checked him from nose to tail. Then, rather than standing with her chest aimed toward the alley, she lowered herself onto the concrete with one side of her body turned toward Michael. The change was small enough that another person might have missed it. Michael did not. She was no longer guarding every possible escape. For the first time, she had allowed part of her attention to rest. Margaret arrived near noon in her aging station wagon with a large transport crate secured in the back. Her silver hair was tucked behind her ears, and her sturdy frame was wrapped in a brown wool coat that looked as practical as everything she owned. Linda followed in the city vehicle after finishing her route, her reflective jacket bright against the gray nursery walls. Neither woman approached the shelter. Margaret helped Michael unload the crate beside the outer gate, while Linda used a small shovel to clear broken plastic, stones, and rusted wire from the path leading toward the truck. They worked quietly. Michael had warned them that a crowd, even a well-meaning one, could make Sadie abandon the nursery. Margaret accepted the instruction without argument, though she watched the shadow beneath the awning with open concern. "She has spent long enough believing every person comes to take something," she said. "Today, we can prove we know how to wait." They placed the large crate near the smaller one and tied its door open. Michael covered the upper half with a towel to make the interior feel sheltered rather than exposed. Food remained outside. No one attempted to lure Sadie in. When they left that afternoon, both crate doors were still open, the bowls were full, and the mother dog had not moved closer. Yet, she had not fled. The third morning arrived with freezing rain. Water clicked against the metal awning and gathered in clear beads along Sadie's dark coat. From the front of the nursery came the distant cough of a diesel engine. One of Daniel Brooks's delivery drivers had arrived early to test a truck before the following day's work. The sound rolled through the empty greenhouses, making Toby flatten himself beside Sadie. Molly pressed against Michael's leg but did not retreat. Time had narrowed. By the next morning, workers would move through the property, forklifts would enter the lanes, and Sadie might carry Toby beyond the route anyone knew. Michael moved the bowls just inside the large crate. Sadie circled it once, nose working along the metal frame. She backed away when the engine sounded again. Michael lowered himself onto the wet concrete and remembered every operation in which patients had felt indistinguishable from helplessness. Luke's death still lived in the part of him that believed waiting was another name for arriving too late. His hands wanted action. His mind built plans involving blankets, barriers, and 3 people closing every escape. But all of those plans ended with Sadie terrified. If he forced her into safety, she might survive while losing the fragile belief that had brought her this far. Michael breathed slowly and did nothing. Molly entered the smaller crate in search of food. Toby followed, stepping over her back to reach the rear corner. 2 clean towels lay inside, but Molly caught one and Toby seized the same piece. They pulled in opposite directions until both slid against the crate wall. Their clumsy struggle made Margaret cover a smile beyond the gate. Sadie watched her puppies move in and out without harm. Then she looked at Michael. Rain ran from the notch in her left ear. She approached the large crate, placed one front paw inside, and froze. Michael kept his gaze lowered. Sadie stepped forward until all 4 paws crossed the threshold. She ate quickly, paused, and looked back at the open yard. Michael did not move. After several seconds, she came out and returned to Toby. Half an hour later, she entered again. This time she remained inside after the food was gone. Michael rose slowly. Sadie's eyes followed him, but she did not retreat. He reached the crate and rested one hand against the door. He moved it inward only a few inches, then opened it again. Sadie shifted her weight but stayed. Michael repeated the motion. The door traveled farther before returning to its original position. On the 3rd attempt, he closed it slowly until the latch touched the frame. Sadie stood, her breath quickening. Michael stopped before the metal clicked. He opened the door again and stepped away. The message had to be clear. She still had a choice. Several minutes passed before Sadie lowered herself onto the towel. Michael returned, closed the door, and pressed the latch into place. No one cheered. Margaret walked forward and placed Michael's truck keys in his palm. Linda collected the 2 stainless steel bowls and carried them toward the vehicle. Their silence gave the moment the weight of a promise. Molly and Toby followed a trail of food into the smaller crate, still pushing each other aside, even though there was room for both. When its door closed, Toby cried once. Sadie lifted her head inside the larger crate and he became quiet. At home, Michael carried Sadie into the mudroom first. He had removed tools and cleaning supplies, covered the floor with rubber mats, and built a secure puppy pen beside the door to the fenced yard. He opened Sadie's crate from behind the barrier and stepped back. She emerged slowly, inspecting the water bowl, the bench, the yard entrance, every corner, and the hallway beyond the gate. Only after she had examined the room did Michael open the smaller crate. Molly rushed out. Toby followed close behind. Sadie touched both puppies with her nose, then allowed them to tumble together across the mats. That night, Michael sat in the hallway outside the pen. He expected Molly to leave her family and curl across his boots as she had every night since the laundromat. Instead, she turned twice beneath a blanket and settled between Sadie and Toby. Sadie rested her chin over Molly's back while Toby pressed against her chest. Michael watched the 3 bodies rise and fall together. Happiness filled the empty places in him, but it carried a quieter truth. He had brought a family out of the cold. That did not mean love would allow him to keep the family unchanged forever. 3 mornings after the rescue, soft sunlight entered Michael's mudroom for the first time in nearly a week, revealing 3 German shepherds asleep together on the rubber mats. Sadie lay closest to the yard door, her lean black and tan body curved around the 2 puppies out of habit, though her breathing was deeper now, and one ear no longer remained raised at every sound. Molly slept with her pale muzzle across Toby's back, while Toby had somehow twisted himself upside down beneath the blanket. All 4 paws pointed toward the wall. When Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived, she entered without her medical bag at first and stood behind the baby gate until Sadie had watched her long enough to lower her head again. Sarah's tall, slender figure and dark braid were already familiar to Michael. but she removed her gray jacket and moved more slowly than she had at the clinic, understanding that this room belonged to Sadie before it belonged to any visitor. She examined the mother first, allowing Sadie to smell each instrument before touching her. The dog's ribs remained visible beneath her coat, yet her heartbeat was steady. Her eyes were clear, and the small notch in her left ear had healed long ago. Molly attempted to climb inside Sarah's open medical bag while Toby stole a roll of gauze and dragged it beneath the bench. "All three are healthy," Sarah said as Michael retrieved it. "Consistent meals, short training sessions, and somewhere Sadie can rest without being followed by two enthusiastic disasters." Michael looked toward the mother dog. Margaret had called her Sadie for weeks, and the name had begun to feel less like a convenience than something she had carried through the cold. "Sadie," he said quietly. The dog's amber eyes shifted toward him. She did not approach, but neither did she look away. Michael decided the name would remain. The house changed faster than any room could be reorganized. Molly still followed Michael into the kitchen, but Toby followed Molly, and Sadie followed far enough behind to be certain both puppies remained safe. Molly pulled clean towels from the laundry basket and ran until one wrapped around her legs. Toby preferred Michael's work gloves, carrying them beneath the dining table and falling asleep with his narrow muzzle resting across the leather. Although Michael placed two identical puppy bowls beside the wall, Molly and Toby insisted on forcing their heads into the same one, leaving the untouched bowl a few inches away. Their disagreements lasted only until one discovered something new to steal. Margaret visited every second day with food, puppy pads, and advice she claimed Michael had not requested, but clearly needed. During one visit, Toby squeezed beneath a kitchen chair, crawled forward until his shoulders reached the far side, and then discovered he could not turn around or reverse. He barked once, waited, and barked again with increasing outrage. Margaret lowered herself carefully beside the chair, her silver hair falling forward from behind one ear. "You are not trapped," she told him. "You are simply too stubborn to use the same direction twice." She lifted the chair and Toby scrambled free before sitting on her shoe. "Toby," she decided, "a dog who creates his own emergencies needs a friendly name." Michael did not mention that she had just named a puppy she continued to describe as temporary. He began training Molly and Toby separately in the fenced yard. Molly was bold, quick to understand hand signals, and equally quick to forget them when a leaf crossed the grass. She could sit perfectly for several seconds, then launch herself after a twig as if obedience had only been a brief misunderstanding. Toby learned more slowly, approaching every new command with suspicion. Once he understood what Michael wanted, however, he repeated it carefully and watched Michael's face for reassurance. The greatest difference appeared whenever Margaret arrived. Toby, who still startled when unfamiliar vehicles passed, recognized the sound of her station wagon before it stopped. He ran to the mudroom gate, carried whichever toy was closest into the kitchen, and settled beneath her chair while she drank coffee. Michael saw the change but did not name it. Some bonds grew quietly because speaking about them too soon made people feel responsible for decisions their hearts had already made. Sadie was changing too. At first, she remained close enough to touch both puppies whenever they slept. Then, Michael found her resting alone beside the yard door. A few days later, she crossed the hallway and lay on a bed in the small room beyond the mudroom, where morning light reached the floor and the puppies could not climb over her without passing Michael. When Molly woke and discovered her mother missing, she searched briefly, found Sadie, and returned to Toby without crying. Sarah explained that Sadie was not rejecting them. "So, for weeks, maybe longer, she has been mother, guard, hunter, and shelter," she said. "Now, she is learning she can leave the room and still find them safe when she comes back." 2 weeks after the rescue, Sarah scheduled Sadie for a routine procedure at the clinic. The puppies no longer depended on her milk, and Sadie was strong enough for the visit, but she would need a quieter house while recovering. Margaret offered to keep Toby for several days. "Only because Molly will climb over Sadie if they are both here," she insisted. Michael noticed she had already brought a blue collar, a familiar blanket, and Toby's preferred food. At Margaret's house, Toby inspected the mudroom, dragged 2 dish towels from a low cabinet, and slept beneath the kitchen table with his head on Margaret's boot. She called Michael before breakfast the next morning. "Does he always snore like an old tractor?" Later, she called because Toby had begun digging beneath the backyard fence. Her granddaughter, Grace Collins, arrived that afternoon to reinforce it. Grace was 27, tall and athletic, with fair freckled skin, gray-blue eyes, and auburn hair tied in a loose ponytail. She had inherited Margaret's directness but softened it with easy humor. After losing her father in a highway accident during college, Grace had made a habit of checking on her grandmother without treating her as fragile. She installed wire beneath the fence while Toby carried away her gloves one at a time. By the second evening, a new water bowl stood in Margaret's kitchen. By the third, a small bed appeared beside the pantry. Margaret maintained that both purchases were temporary, though Toby's name had already been written on the food container. When Sadie returned from the clinic, Molly greeted her through the gate, touched noses, and stepped back when her mother moved towards the quiet room. Toby visited several days later. He and Molly immediately seized opposite ends of a towel and dragged it across the floor while Sadie watched from outside the pen. She checked each puppy once, then chose to lie near Michael rather than between them. Michael understood what Sarah had meant. Sadie had spent so long keeping her family alive that no one had asked what kind of life she might want when survival was no longer the only task. Michael could keep all 3 dogs. He had enough money, a fenced yard, and more discipline than most people would bring to the work, but ability was not the same as wisdom. Molly had attached herself to him and needed individual training. Toby became calmer in Margaret's kitchen than anywhere else. Sadie deserved a home where she would not spend every hour listening for puppies behind her. Sarah introduced them to Robert and Helen Whitaker through a foster coordinator. Robert was 66, a tall, spare man with silver hair, a carefully trimmed white beard, and the long, angular face of someone who listened more than he spoke. He had worked as a high school history teacher for 35 years, and retirement had left him patient with silence rather than afraid of it. Helen, 63, was shorter and softly built, with warm brown skin, dark eyes, and thick gray curls cut just above her shoulders. She had been a hospital nurse until arthritis forced her to retire. Years of sitting beside frightened patients had taught her that comfort did not always require touch. Their previous dog had died 2 years earlier, and they had waited because neither wanted grief to choose the next animal for them. During the first meeting, Robert and Helen sat at the far end of the shelter room and did not call Sadie. She remained beside the wall, watching their hands on the door. During the second visit, they walked with her through a fenced garden. Robert held the loose leash without pulling, while Helen allowed Sadie to stop at every unfamiliar sound. Neither tried to shorten the distance. On the third visit, Helen sat beside a sunlit window while Robert remained several feet away. Sadie circled the room once, paused before the open doorway as if reminding herself she could still leave, then turned back. She crossed the quiet space, lowered herself beside Helen's feet, and rested there. Sadie rested her chin across Helen Whitaker's shoe and closed her eyes as though the decision had required every remaining ounce of courage. Helen did not reach down immediately. She kept both hands folded loosely in her lap, allowing the lean German shepherd to feel the warmth of her presence without being trapped by it. Robert remained several feet away, his tall, narrow frame relaxed beside the sunlit wall, his silver hair and carefully trimmed white beard glowing softly in the afternoon light. He did not ask when they could sign the adoption papers. Instead, he looked toward the foster coordinator and said, "We can come back as many times as she needs." That sentence told Michael more about the couple than any application could have. Robert and Helen did not want Sadie because they expected her to fill the empty place left by their previous dog. They wanted to give her enough time to decide whether their quiet home could become hers. Sadie opened her amber eyes, looked briefly toward Michael, then pressed her muzzle more firmly against Helen's shoe. Michael felt the answer settle inside him. Sadie had spent weeks choosing between danger and her puppies. At last, she was being offered a life in which no one demanded an immediate choice. The paperwork was completed later that afternoon. though Robert and Helen agreed to make the transition slowly. They visited Michael's house twice more, walking with Sadie in the fenced yard and sitting in the mudroom while Molly and Toby played behind the gate. Helen never blocked Sadie's path to the door. Robert spoke in the same calm voice he had once used with anxious students who needed time to answer. By the final visit, Sadie no longer stood between the puppies and the couple. She rested near the hallway, watching without carrying the entire room on her shoulders. On the morning she left, Michael placed the large transport crate beside the truck and spread the familiar blanket across its floor. The open door brought back the image of the veterinary clinic. The rain, the untouched food, and Sadie standing at the edge of the truck's shadow while another puppy waited somewhere to the east. Back then, she had turned away because love demanded her return. This time, Sadie smelled the blanket, looked toward Molly and Toby behind the mudroom gate, then stepped inside without being lifted or pulled. She turned once and lay down. Michael closed the door gently. The metal latch clicked, but Sadie did not rise. She knew the sound no longer meant she had lost control of her life. Molly stood beside Michael as Robert's vehicle moved down the driveway. She watched until it disappeared at the corner, then caught the loose edge of Michael's glove and began pulling with both front paws planted against the porch. The ordinary mischief broke through the grief before it could harden. Michael crouched and took the glove from her mouth. "You always know when a moment is becoming too serious," he said. Molly tilted her head, one ear upright and the other still slightly folded, then seized the glove again. Inside the house, 3 bowls remained along the wall. Michael stared at the largest one for several seconds before washing it and placing it in the cupboard. The room looked emptier, but not abandoned. Sadie's absence carried peace rather than panic. She had not vanished into the rain. Michael knew where she was going, who would open the door for her, and what kind of silence would wait on the other side. Toby's future revealed itself with less ceremony. Margaret had continued calling him a temporary guest even after his blue collar appeared beside the grocery register. One afternoon, Grace picked it up and turned the metal tag toward the light. Toby's name had already been engraved on one side, while Margaret's telephone number filled the other. Grace, tall and freckled with auburn hair tied loosely behind her head, raised one eyebrow at her grandmother. "That is a very permanent-looking temporary collar." Margaret adjusted the red cord of her reading glasses and continued stacking soup cans. The engraving was included in the price. So was his name, Grace asked. Toby sat between them with one of Margaret's dish towels hanging from his mouth. Margaret looked down at the puppy, whose soft ears folded outward while his dark eyes watched her with complete confidence. He dropped the towel and rested one paw on her shoe. Margaret exhaled as though accepting defeat in an argument no one else had been having. "He already knows the kitchen," she said. Moving him now would confuse the poor creature. That evening, she signed the adoption papers. Grace agreed to help with morning walks, training sessions, and any future fence repairs Toby's imagination might require. Michael officially adopted Molly the same week. When Sarah handed him the final documents at Blue Ridge Veterinary Clinic, Molly tried to steal the pen, then planted herself across his boots exactly as she had during her first examination. Sarah's dark hazel eyes softened. She made her decision before any of us did. Michael looked down at the puppy who had once waited beneath a laundromat awning, calling toward an empty street. He had imagined rescue as an action with a beginning and an end. Locate the endangered life, remove it from danger, bring it home. Molly had taught him that rescue continued through every meal, every muddy paw print, every command repeated patiently, and every morning when a living creature trusted that he would still be there. He signed his name. The motion felt less like taking ownership than accepting a promise. The 3 homes stood only a few streets apart. On Sunday mornings, Michael brought Molly to Margaret's fenced yard. Toby usually heard the truck before it stopped and raced from the back step, his tan and black body growing stronger each week. Molly leaped from the vehicle, and the 2 puppies ran around the wooden table until one discovered a ball. Although Grace always placed 2 toys in the grass, they fought over the same one, pulling in opposite directions until both lost their grip and rolled across the yard. Margaret set down 2 water bowls, yet Molly and Toby forced their heads into one, bumping cheeks and splashing the other bowl without touching it. Michael and Grace worked on separate training exercises, while Margaret watched from the porch and issued advice with the confidence of someone who had recently denied wanting a dog. Toby became less fearful of passing vehicles, though he still checked Margaret's location whenever an engine sounded. Molly grew taller and more confident, but Leaves remained capable of destroying every lesson Michael had taught her. Sadie did not visit immediately. Sarah advised giving her time to settle without the puppies pulling her back into constant vigilance. Robert and Helen sent updates instead. In the first photograph, Sadie stood near the back door, uncertain but calm. In the second, she slept on a clean bed beside a wide window. In the third, she lay in a patch of sunlight with Helen reading nearby and Robert working quietly in the garden beyond the open door. Her ribs were less visible, her coat had begun to shine, and the muscles around her eyes no longer remained tense. Robert wrote that she had started carrying one of his slippers into the living room each evening. Helen added that Sadie still checked every room before sleeping, but she no longer returned repeatedly to count invisible puppies. Several weeks later, Robert and Helen brought Sadie to Margaret's yard. Michael kept Molly and Toby on loose leashes at first. Sadie entered slowly, smelled the familiar air, and looked toward the 2 young dogs. Molly approached first and touched her nose to Sadie's cheek. Toby followed, pressing briefly beneath his mother's neck. Sadie checked both of them, then stepped aside when they began chasing each other around the table. She did not gather them close or position herself between them and the people. Instead, she walked to Helen and lay beside her chair. Michael felt an ache at the sight, but it was a clean ache, the kind that came when love had reached the place it had been trying to find. Spring finally reached Roanoke. The last patches of snow disappeared from shaded fences and green grass returned beneath the Blue Ridge foothills. At Michael's house, only Molly's bowl remained against the kitchen wall, yet the rooms no longer seemed hollow. Each morning she woke him by pulling the edge of his blanket, then ran toward the back door with the confidence of a dog who knew he would follow. Michael still kept Luke Dawson's metal tag in the bedside drawer. The memory no longer vanished, but it no longer controlled every act of kindness that came afterward. He had once believed failure meant arriving too late, and redemption meant never leaving anyone behind. Sadie, Molly, and Toby had taught him something more difficult. Sometimes saving a family did not mean keeping everyone beneath the same roof. Sometimes it meant finding the place where each life could breathe, grow, and finally stop waiting. That Sunday, Molly and Toby raced across Margaret's yard while Sadie rested near Helen's feet. Robert stood beside Michael at the fence, watching the 3 dogs beneath the warm morning sun. 3 homes now held 3 separate food bowls, 3 beds, and 3 doors that would always open for them. None of the dogs would sleep beneath a leaking awning again. None would wait alone in a cold greenhouse. And whenever they came together, they did not look like a family that had been divided. They looked like a family large enough to belong in more than one place. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder, light, or angels. Sometimes they appear beneath a cold awning, in muddy paw prints, or in the quiet trust of a frightened animal. Michael believed he was rescuing Molly, Toby, and Sadie, but through them, God also rescued the part of his heart that had forgotten how to hope. In daily life, we may not always see the purpose behind a delay, a loss, or an unexpected responsibility. Yet a small act of patience can become someone else's answered prayer. Love is not always holding on. Sometimes it is guiding another life toward the home where it can rest. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave your thoughts or prayers in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of faith and kindness. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your home with peace.